My title, the hint half guessed, Broken Beauty, will hopefully come clear before too long. This conference identifies as its primary theme beauty. And last night we heard from Fred on the topic of what is beauty. This morning we heard from Carol about some of the implications of beauty in our curriculum. And I'm just so that I know who I'm speaking with, how many people here are actually educators in the secondary school, like high school? And what about middle school? A few? Primary school? Wow. So that's by far the largest number of people. You are my heroes. I taught very briefly primary school kids and then up through high school for about 3 years. And I was so utterly overcome by it that I took refuge in college teaching. So I really do think it's a high calling to teach kids. I have 2 kids of my own and 5 grandkids, and I love teaching them outside of a formal classroom where I have to maintain order. I don't know if you noticed, I allowed my screen to sort of dim a little bit and focused on this bowl. And maybe you know a little bit about kintsugi. It's a Japanese, if you don't know, I'll just tell you briefly. It's a Japanese practice of taking broken things and mending them in such a way that you do not disguise the breakage. In fact, you highlight it with a careful mixture of lacquer and gold, genuine gold. So that the fissures in a broken pot or a broken cup become the primary source of aesthetic pleasure for people in the kintsugi and wabi-sabi tradition in Japan, which began with a tea master, Zen master by the name of Sen no Rikyū. And he sheltered Christians during the great pogroms in Japan. You know, Christianity made a kind of beachhead in the 16th century, 17th century, and then what happened there was the shoguns, the rulers, realized that this was undermining their absolute authority over the populace. Christianity has this way of kind of making people a little bit too independent, if it's practiced properly. They wanted to stamp it out. And Sen no Rikyū in Kyoto, which used to be the capital of Japan, he was in the Daikotaji monastery, and he sheltered Christians there. His own wife was a convert to Catholicism. And he's the one who founded the whole tea ceremony, as we understand it in Japanese culture, which, if you know anything about Japanese culture, it's the centerpiece of Japanese culture. Now, some scholars think that maybe Sen no Rikyū was a closet Christian. He was a Zen master, so he was not able to publicly declare, but his wife was, in fact, a Christian. And why is this important? Well, because Sen no Rikyū founded the wabi-sabi movement, rescuing Japan aesthetic from the strong influence of Korea and China, which is a very refined aesthetic. And the Japanese aesthetic gradually, under Sen no Rikyū's leadership, became more about rustic qualities, the beauty in rustic things, small things, things that are broken. And the thing is, at the heart of Christian faith, now I'm not talking about how it's always practiced. Sometimes Christian faith is practiced in completely wildly diverse ways, in ways that are unrecognizable, to my mind, from what I understand it to be. But at the heart of Christianity is this theme of brokenness. That God, when God came among us, got broken, took on God's own self, our brokenness. So it's not about perfectionism. In fact, and it's not about a super refined understanding of beauty, but it's beauty in the midst of and through, in and through, the reality of everyday life. Our broken lives. Now, there may be some perfect people in this room. If you are, would you please leave, because you're going to be offended. Just kidding, you can stay. So a couple of things I'd like to look at here. One is tradition, and the other I'm going to talk about in a moment. And for that, I'm going to start with a quote from Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German philosopher who I love, and in his wonderful essay, The Relevance of the Beautiful, talks about beauty in terms of threefold way, in terms of symbol, play, and festival. And I won't go into his entire understanding of how those three things play out. But I like the fact that play is at the centerpiece. But also tradition is in and through everything he talks about in that essay. And I'm just going to read this for you. Tradition means transmission rather than conservation. This transmission does not imply that we leave things unchanged and merely conserve them. It means learning how to grasp and express the past anew. In this sense, we can say that transmission is equivalent to translation. So every act of genuine involvement in tradition necessarily involves translation. You can't just capture the fly and preserve it in amber. Or you can, but what you have to do in order to do that is to kill it. So a living tradition has to be moving. It has to change. It has to unfold. It has to develop. It has to elaborate. It has to get translated and transmitted from one generation to the next. Next theme I want to look at, another kind of authority I'm submitting to here, is T.S. Eliot. For most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction fit, lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or music heard so deeply that it's not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. These are only hints and guesses. Hints followed by guesses. And the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood, is incarnation. There's a lot there. I mean, you could take that quote away, and I could just shut up right now, and we just spend the whole period talking about what's in this. So I'm just going to lift out a couple things quickly. The imagery is rich, and the thing about Four Quartets, if you haven't read the poem, a lot of people feel intimidated by it because it's, to read it aloud takes 45 minutes. There are four poems, each with a 5 subsections. But I do recommend, if you're interested in Eliot, that you read his poetry aloud. It's very much musical. It is not meant to be merely comprehended. It's meant to be felt, internalized. Somewhere between your chin and your waist is where you should receive Eliot a lot of the time, certainly through the ear. But I'm going to lift out one thing. So this idea that the music, when it's heard deeply, it's not music at all. You are the music while the music lasts. And he points out that all you can get from this is a hint of what's really going on in the cosmos. Another place in the poem, he says, garlic and sapphires in the mud clot the bedded axletree. The trilling wire in the blood sings below inveterate scars, appeasing long-forgotten wars. The dance along the arteries. The circulation of the lymph are figured in the drift of stars. He talks about how our own bodies are mirrors of the cosmic patterns, the lawful patterns within the cosmos. It's really interesting. If you just think for a second here, I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but think for a moment. Your own vascular system, he talks about the circulation of lymph is figured in the drift of stars. Your own vascular system is almost identical with what rivers look like from 60,000 feet. And rivers seen from 60,000 feet are almost identical to what trees look like. How is that? There are cosmic patterns of beautiful design that are constantly elaborating themselves in and through us. So we are the music while the music lasts, as he says. And lastly, the gift half guessed. The gift, the hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. I'll come back to that in just a few moments. But incarnation is at the heart of what I want to talk about today, this broken beauty. Another authority figure I want to turn to, Calvin and Hobbes, of course, right? Look at that kid's snowman. What a pathetic cliche. Am I supposed to identify with this complacent moron and his shovel? This snowman says nothing about the human condition. Is this all the kid has to say about contemporary suburban life? The soulless banality of this snowman is a sad comment on today's art world. Now come look at my snowman. I call it the torment of existence weighed against the horror of non-being. As he melts, the sculpture will become even more poignant. And then Hobbes says, I admire your willingness to put artistic integrity before marketability. Yeah, so, along with T.S. Eliot, Bill Watterson, he's my man. I grieved terribly when he stopped doing his comic strip. So Incarnation, another major person I'd like to hear from here is Flannery O'Connor. This may be familiar to you, but she says in her Fiction Writer in His Country, the novelist, and one could say artist, with Christian concerns will find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to him. And his problem will be to make these appear as distortions to an audience that is used to seeing them as normal, as natural. And he may well be forced to take ever more violent means to get his vision across to this hostile audience. When you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax a little and use more normal means of talking to it. When you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout. To the almost blind, you draw large, startling figures. So you have any question about why modern artists have chosen to try to shock their viewers? I think in O'Connor's statement here, you get the reason why. The 20th century was a century of unprecedented carnage, of political duplicity, 2 major world wars in which hundreds of thousands of people were sacrificed like lambs to the slaughter over political and geopolitical moves. And this is going on again right now in Ukraine. The same old, same old. So artists are saying, I'm sorry, you want pretty pictures? Look somewhere else, please. Someone who's willing to live with total denial. Well, you know what? There's a precedent. It's not just modern art that does this shock thing. This is a detail, the center of an altarpiece by Matthias Grunewald in the early 16th century. This now in Colmar, France, in the Unterlinden Museum. But originally, this altarpiece hung in a chapel in a hospital for people suffering from St. Anthony's fire, which is ergot poisoning. It was thought to be highly contagious, like leprosy, and it had the same effect as leprosy. People would lose their limbs through gangrene, fingers, toes, feet, legs, arms, facial features. They were visited by terrible hallucinations and sometimes psychosis. So they were quarantined because people believed it was contagious. In fact, it wasn't. It was from tainted rye flour that had the ergot fungus growing in it. By the way, LSD is concocted from ergot. So, these people were undergoing something really horrific. But Matthias Grunewald made an altarpiece for them, for people that felt ugly, who felt cut off, who felt sent away, quarantined. And we can sort of relate now because of the pandemic, right? Some of us have even had family members that have died alone in the hospital without any comfort from their family because of this terrible illness. So, and it's highly contagious. We're wearing masks and hazmat suits, et cetera. Well, one thing about this altarpiece, you can't see it unless you're actually up close to it, is that in order to open the altarpiece to see the beautiful interior, which I'll show you in a moment, you have to cut off Christ's right arm. The seam for the door on the altarpiece goes right through his arm, deliberately. So when you open the door, you cut off Christ's right arm. It's as though Grunewald is saying, I would give my right arm for you, Christ is saying. In fact, I can be dismembered too, just like you people in this hospital who feel so estranged from your families. Inside, you see on the far left the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel coming to Mary saying, "Highly favored one, God is with you. You will give birth to the God-man, the Messiah." In the middle panel, you see the Nativity. The Christ child has been born, and the angels are singing. So are the beasts in the background. There's a beautiful cloud burst kind of angelic beings. And then in the right-hand side, you see the resurrection of Christ. But below, it's interesting, below you still see the entombment. So you can see the main altarpiece here, and underneath it is the entombment. Let's see if I can back it up so you can see, yeah. There's the dead Christ below. And even when you open it, and you see, the Annunciation, the Nativity, the resurrection, these celebratory aspects of the Christian faith, you still see the dead Christ. It's quite intentional, because the people in that hospital, they saw death every day. And we've been seeing unprecedented amount of death. And this just shows you the scale of the altarpiece in the Interlinden Museum. Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I wanted to start with Matthias Grunewald's Eisenheim altarpiece because it's a garish, ugly Christ. The actual color of the skin is kind of greenish, and it's quite intentional. But it's beautiful. How can it be both beautiful and horrific? This is what I want you to do. I want you to hold these things in tension a little bit while we're talking this morning. I'm going to talk about my own work in a moment, but I want to show you one of the artists who had a huge impact on me, and that's Georges Rouault, 20th century French painter, who studied under Gustave Moreau. Maybe you heard of Gustave Moreau. He was known for his fantastical, highly resolved, highly naturalistic proportioned figures, but kind of fantastical stories, angels and demons, in this case an apparition of the head of the Baptist, John the Baptist, in a kind of nightmarish manifestation to Salome. But I wanted to show you also that Rouault, if you're familiar with his work, he started out doing these very, very influenced by Moreau, these beautiful, naturalistically rendered, traditional-looking figures. This is the morning star, two different versions of the morning star, mythological female figure. But then something happened in the early 20th century. Rouault started realizing that these pretty pictures were not communicating what he felt was most central to human experience, which is pain and suffering and difficulty. We also have hope and joy, but you have to give voice to the darker side of life. And so what he did was he started painting, so you can see a comparison here with what happened in this 1908 Woman with Red Hair is the title, but she's a prostitute. And you can see in this other one where he says, prostitute before her mirror. There's no attempt to glamorize prostitution. There's no attempt to make her pretty, even though she might have been a very beautiful woman. But the point of Rouault's painting is to say, look, this thing, prostitution, is horrific. It's ugly. It's not something I'm going to prettify. You'll see a little bit later on in my slideshow here what had preceded Rouault's interpretation of prostitution and went at it a very different way. Many scholars think this is a self-portrait. It's called The Workman's Apprentice. He had not only worked for Gustave Moreau, but he'd also worked to repair and to create stained glass windows. So you see this black line around everything and the bright colors, very much influenced by his experience doing stained glass. And this deliberately crude and kind of crusty painting technique, very different from what he had been doing under Gustave Moreau. So there's a shift that took place there, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to talk about my own work now and how I was influenced by Moreau, by Gustave Moreau and Georges Rouault, actually. This is just a shot from my studio in the 1980s, give you a sense of the scale of the work. And I'm going to start really quickly in my undergraduate years. I was trained in a very traditional kind of approach to painting. Did a lot of self-portraits, cheap model, right? Model always shows up when it's supposed to. But I underwent a kind of a change myself, where Rouault's work started having an impact on me. I apologize for the quality of what's on the screen here. The color is actually kind of deadened on the screen. What I'm seeing on my computer and in real life is much richer. But you can see some of these encaustic paintings that were influenced by Rouault. I had been trained in this very classical approach, but began to explore what's possible to get at stuff that can't be communicated through conventionally pretty pictures, okay? Again, this just shows you the scale of the work. One of my influences, other than Georges Rouault, was Max Beckmann, the German painter. And of course, Philip Guston, whose work I'm not going to show, but that Brighton mentioned. By the way, there's a major Philip Guston retrospective that's opening in early May in Boston, at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Then it goes to the Tate in London. Then it goes to the Houston Fine Arts Museum, and then it ends its tour at the National Gallery in Washington. Massive retrospective of Philip Guston's work. So I highly recommend you try to take it in. This is a wonderful large triptych at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard that I used to go visit when I was an art student. Back when I was learning to draw from the figure and do those realistic, all those tons and tons and tons of realistic paintings, when I saw this painting, I was just bowled over. That somehow the color, the drama, the emotional tenor of the work is what I think gripped me. When I was in grad school, I did this painting, The Muse, and this one, Caiaphas and the Hypocrites. You know, I think when you're in graduate school as a painter, you feel like you have to solve every problem. You've got to say it all. So it's like everything was crammed in there. You got Pablo Picasso in the middle wearing a Padres outfit. You've got Max Beckmann off on the left blowing a saxophone. He did tons of self-portraits with a saxophone. You got this sort of Levite with a ladder and a bird at the end of it's kind of the bird of the soul, and it's the ascension, the Jacob's ladder, the Jewish tradition, which was heavily influencing me at the time. And then you've got me behind them all wearing a welder's helmet, reaching across and recording this amazing event, which is everyone's in there together. But one of the things I was trying to do was I was trying to see if religion, at the time I was not a believing Christian, so I was in my mid-20s. I was very much involved in Eastern philosophy at the time. But I was drawn to the Bible because of its crazy stories. I don't know if any of you here have read the Bible, but it should be X-rated for violence and for sex and for all kinds of crazy stuff, as well as God making himself known. But this figure model, who everybody's gathered around, has three faces in the foreground there, and then some art student dutifully recording the whole thing. I was, a grad student trying to figure out, does this stuff matter anymore? Do religious ideas matter? And then what's the fitting form that I'm going to give to my work if I'm not just interested in pretty aspects of beauty, but also its profound realities, the truth. Truth, beauty, and goodness are deeply interwoven. So if you subtract one or the other, you get a travesty. So what would beauty without truth be? It'd be a seduction. What would truth without beauty be? It'd be a blunt instrument. What would goodness be without truth? It'd be sentimentality. So you got these weird ways in which those three transcendental realities have been torn apart in our time. And beauty without truth, and if the truth is that there's carnage going on, World War I, World War II, you name it, right up to the present moment, the Bolshevik Revolution, if we get on the list, is just horrendous for the last 100 years. If you subtract the truth, what you get is this kind of prettiness, which isn't really true. It's beautiful, yeah, but. Another group of artists that had an impact on me right around the time I was getting out of grad school and into the 1980s were the feminist artists who were beginning to really question in a forceful way why Western art history was so incredibly dominated by the male gaze. It was all about satisfying the male gaze. And it was often turning female bodies into objects of desire, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But so Barbara Kruger saying, wait a minute, it's your body, one, but by the way, it's a battleground. There's another war going on here, and it's a war of women to say, you can no longer colonize my body. You can no longer objectify me and use me for your pleasure. I love this. The Guerrilla Girls, if you're not familiar with their work, they went around in gorilla masks and sort of would, some of them were really highly placed women in New York City in the beginning. And they funded this billboard campaign. Do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern arts section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. All right, do the math. But this is what they were riffing on. This famous painting by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, a prostitute, odalisque. That tradition of the beautiful prostitute, the grande odalisque, it was very much a thing in Western painting. So they were problematizing Ingres and that whole tradition of the male gaze. I found that really compelling. If you want to tell the truth, not just prettify it, you better listen to these people. This is the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where I live. They were driving a truck around with a billboard on it. Did women have to get naked to get into Boston museums, et cetera? Same sort of thing. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. A century earlier, you have someone like Emily Dickinson hiding out in her room, writing tough as nails poetry about life and death, about relationships, but with compassion. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. So these are influences on my own thinking as an artist, as a young artist. Some profound expressionists from Germany and France, but also the women artists of the 1980s. And then in 1982, I had this experience, which I won't tell you the whole story. I'll just say that suddenly the Eastern philosophy that I've been practicing for 15 years seemed to be, it was all about detachment. It was all about escaping suffering. You know, Buddha talked about the ultimate reality being nirvana, which means the snuffing out of the candle. The problem, Buddha said, with human beings, what causes suffering is desire. So the way to end suffering is to extinguish desire. Put out the candle. That's nirvana. That's liberation, according to, right at the heart of Eastern philosophy is this idea that you can end suffering, but the way you do it is by eliminating desire. And that includes relationships, because relationships are based on desire. There's no way around it. The mother desires her child, the child desires the mother, the husband desires the wife desires the husband. The friend desires the friend desires the friend. I mean, desire is what draws us together. So it's really about eliminating everything. In fact, nirvana is also equated with nothing. It's the great emptiness. I couldn't accept that, finally. Especially when I looked around me and I saw suffering. I saw women suffering because their bodies were being objectified and they were being used, and I saw children suffering. I saw students suffering. I was in school in the 1960s when the Kent State riots happened, and I saw kids being shot at by police. There were lynchings still going on. The Jim Crow laws were active in the South. And racism is still alive and well in America. So what are you just going to escape and paste over it a pretty picture? No. But right around that same time, reading the Bible, mostly for its literary content and its artistic possibilities, I ended up getting converted. And so Carl Bell's the director of the Rose Art Museum in Boston, who was a very influential figure in Boston at the time, in the late 70s, early 80s. He had come to my studio in Dorchester, you saw the photograph, and he said, Bruce, you're a really interesting painter. You're a powerful painter. You're too much under the influence of Max Beckmann and Georges Rouault. So give me a call and have me visit your studio when you've worked through those influences. You're a young guy, you got plenty of time. I said, thanks, I'd love to do that. So I get converted to Christian faith, and I started making these paintings. The Crowning. The Flogging. Night. So, I sent some slides of my work to Carl Bells. I said, Carl, what do you think of these? And luckily, the guy was honest enough. He wrote me a 2-page letter back. He said, Bruce, I still think you're a great painter, but you're painting these images of Christ as though you actually believe this shit. Those were his exact words. You can't do that, period. You're committing intellectual suicide. And it's a career non-starter. I mean, how many museum people are going to tell you that directly? Normally what you would hear is, well, we're moving in a slightly different direction than you, so we're not interested in your work. So I grabbed Carl, and I drove him to an exhibition of these paintings, and he spent, to his credit, he spent an hour and a half there, and he said, sorry, buddy, I still think the same thing. You're a great painter, but you're committing intellectual suicide. You act like you're painting these things like you really mean it. So anyway, I'm looking at my screen here. I'm seeing a slide out of order. So if you'll forgive me for a moment, I'm going to back out of that. See if I can do that and just get rid of it because it's not in the right place. There we go. Okay. So this painting, Night, was used for the world premiere of James Macmillan's great choral work, the St. Luke Passion. I don't know if you know Macmillan's work, but he's a wonderful composer. I highly recommend his work. I was very honored by that. So Carl was right to some extent that it was a career non-starter, but that was almost 40 years ago, and my work, is, as you heard from our friend Brighton, has been exhibited all over the world, and I sell my work all the time. I've had a really good career. I'll be 70 next year, and I'm still going strong, and Carl was wrong. And what I said to him at the time was, Carl, brother, I hope you live long enough to eat your words. Well, sadly, Carl passed away before he got a chance to eat his words. But, you know, I actually recommend for young artists not to be intimidated by museum people. Unfortunately, most of them are very indirect compared to Carl. It kept me, you know, the fact that he gave me something to fight with was good, you know. So a couple more shots of my work here. This is something from the early 2000s. In 1997, my house was struck by lightning, and my studio and my house burned down. So all of my work went up in flames, with the exception of those Golgotha paintings of Christ. And the only reason those didn't burn, the Good Friday paintings, there's a real practical reason they didn't burn. Is because the day before the fire, a collector came to my house and said, can you pull out some of those paintings you did about Good Friday? I'd like to look at them. So I pulled them out of the storage racks, moved them into my studio, which had a firewall, which was supposed to protect the house from the studio, because, you know, you use flammable things in the studio. It did the reverse. It protected the studio from the house, which was just like an inferno. And the only paintings that I had out in the studio were the Good Friday paintings. So, it's just one of those weird freaks of nature. But so the slate was cleaned by that fire. And I started doing this series of paintings when I finally was able to rebuild the studio. And I called the cycle Building in Ruins. And you can see here that I began to sample or move into some of these paintings bits from tradition that I felt influenced by. And this famous Fra Angelico painting, one of the meditation cells in Monastery San Marco in Florence, is in the background there. You can sort of see it in this shattered wall. Boy, the slides are really distorted by this. They only had a very old projector for this room, so apologies. You're not getting the feel of the work, really. Here's another one from that period. Oh, wow. All the colors completely out in that one. Meditation. Yeah, this one too. All the oranges and reds in my paintings and all the gold, it gets flattened out into these kind of weird salmon color. I started using a lot of gold leaf, which is another thing associated with altarpieces. This is Elegy for Bonhoeffer, also badly off by color, unfortunately. But you can see the Nazi Stalag in the background dissolving, even as Bonhoeffer is executed. I don't know if you know his story. He was a martyr. He was a Christian theologian who had moved from Germany to New York. He was at Union Seminary in New York for a number of years and preached often at Riverside Church. But when the Nazi regime started rising, he went back to Germany because he felt like he owed it to his students, he owed it to his people to resist and to work against the Nazis. And he eventually became part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. That was found out, and he was put under house arrest and then was eventually executed. Actually, after the war ended and the Allied forces had declared victory, they went ahead and hung him. But I have him upside down, like St. Peter, and kind of descending into glory. What's underneath there is all gold leaf. So his figure is sort of dipping sort of descending into heaven, I guess. Another aspect of my work I'll quickly cover is collaboration. This is more recent. I do a lot of work with other artists now, poets, composers, other painters. This was the first one I did, was the Florence portfolio with 6 other artists. This was recently turned into a book. I'll just quickly go through. It was an etching portfolio that we did in Italy. And a program, as a result of that trip to Italy, a program was formed in Orvieto that one of my colleagues and I started there. Sorry about the color again. Oh my gosh, it's really so distorted. This is a large altarpiece I did for a collaboration with Karin Kunrad, a theater director in New York. And it was installed in a monastery in Italy. Here's the central panel overshadowed, gold leaf. It's almost not worth showing these. They're so distorted. Such is life. Another project with a lot of other artists, 15 other artists, called A Broken Beauty. It was at a museum in California, Laguna Art Museum. All of us were using sacred subject matter, but approaching it from a contemporary standpoint, rather than the more traditionalist approach. Again, for the same reasons I've been trying to elaborate here. A more recent one, a collaboration with the Japanese-American painter Makoto Fujimura and a composer who teaches a graduate composition at Yale, Christopher Theovenidis, and a theologian from Duke University, Jeremy Begbie. This was based on Eliot's 4 quartets, and I did 4 very large paintings based on this 4 seasons. I think I'm only showing maybe 2 of them, winter and spring. Here's Mako's work. They're quite dark, but they're quite luminous in their darkness. And more recently, did an artist in residency at Duke University and was commissioned to do this piece here, which I'll show you a brief video. I literally had to cut them apart. So when I did this video is about 3/4 of the way done. And I'll quickly show you how it ended up. Yeah, the color is so far off, it's embarrassing. You guys will forgive. So I think I'll end here just so you can see there was a kind of a deep symbolic progression inside the work.